In the High Sierra, silence is never a peaceful thing. It is a threat, heavy and cold. When the great winter storms of 1856 buried these mountains under 20 feet of snow, a chimney without smoke was more than just a sign of a cold hearth. It was the universal silent scream of a frontier grave. For one man watching from a distant ridgeline, that empty sky wasn't just a tragedy, it was a call to war against the winter itself. To understand the sheer madness of what was about to happen, we have to step back into the frozen reality of the American West. This was the mid-19th century, and this land was not part of the civilized world. This was the Nevada Territory and the California borderlands, a place where the map was mostly blank and the weather was the only law that anyone respected. In 1856, a winter of biblical proportions descended upon the Sierra Nevada. Mountain passes were blocked by walls of white, and entire towns were cut off from the rest of humanity. The mail, which was the only lifeline to the outside world, simply stopped running. For the settlers trapped in those deep valleys, the snow was a prison wall that reached all the way to the sky. But there was one man who didn't see walls when he looked at the drifts. He saw a highway. He was a man who would become a legend, not because he conquered the mountains, but because he learned to dance with them while carrying the weight of the world on his back. His name was John Thompson, though the history books and the locals would soon know him by a different name, Snowshoe Thompson. He was a Norwegian immigrant with eyes the color of a frozen lake and a constitution that seemed to be carved from solid granite. Thompson was an anomaly in the gold-crazed west of that era. While every other man was digging for a fortune in the mud and the dark of the mines, Thompson looked upward to the snow. He had taken a contract to carry the mail across the Sierra Nevada at a time when no horse, mule, or wagon could even dream of making the crossing. But Thompson didn't use the clumsy, racket-shaped snowshoes that the trappers and explorers had used for generations. Instead, he brought something from the old country, something the miners in California had never seen before. He called them longboards. They were massive hand-carved planks of solid oak, 10 feet long and weighing nearly 25 pounds apiece. To the folks who didn't know any better, they looked like nothing more than lumberyard scraps, unwieldy and impossible for any man to maneuver. But to Thompson, those planks were wings. It is important to understand his technique because it was unlike anything the Americans had ever witnessed. He didn't use 2 ski poles to push himself along. Instead, he carried a single heavy wooden staff, a balance pole. Now, I want you to remember that pole because it was his most vital tool. He held it horizontally across his body, much like a tightrope walker would hold a bar for stability. It served as his rudder, his brake, and his stabilizer all at once. On the steep, icy descents where he could reach speeds of 60 miles an hour, that single pole was the only thing keeping him from shattering his body against the ancient pines. He was a master of momentum, using the sheer weight of the longboards and the leverage of that pole to carve through terrain that would have swallowed a normal man whole. He was the underdog only in the sense that nature is always the favorite in a fight, but in his element, gliding silently over 20-foot drifts with an 80-pound mailbag strapped to his back, John Thompson was a king. He was comfortable in the biting cold and felt a strange kind of safety in the solitude of the high peaks. But the mountains have a way of testing even the kings among men, and on a gray afternoon in late December, the test arrived. It didn't come as a sudden storm or a crashing avalanche, but as a terrifying, heavy stillness. It was 2 days before Christmas, the 23rd of December, 1856. Thompson was miles into his route, cutting through the dense, muffled silence near Lake Valley, an area we know today as South Lake Tahoe. The snow was incredibly deep, consisting of fresh powder sitting precariously over a hard crust. These were the kind of conditions where a man could disappear in an instant and not be found until the spring thaw. As he crested a high ridge, his eyes scanned the white expanse for familiar landmarks. He knew every tree and every rock formation in these hills, but the heavy snowfall had reshaped the entire world into something alien and beautiful. Then he saw it. It was a small cabin, barely visible against the white, buried nearly up to its eaves in a massive drift. He knew it belonged to a lonely trapper named James Sisson. Thompson paused for a moment, leaning heavily on his balance pole, his breath clouding in the frigid air like ghost smoke. He waited. He watched the top of the chimney with an intensity born of experience. In this weather, a fire was more than a comfort. It was life itself. A fire meant hot coffee, warmth, and the will to keep going. But the air above the chimney was perfectly clear. There was no gray plume of wood smoke, no heat shimmer to distort the horizon. There was only cold stone standing against a cold, uncaring sky. Thompson didn't hesitate for a second. He tipped his long skis forward and slid down the embankment, the oak boards slapping rhythmically against the snow. When he reached the cabin, the silence felt heavy, almost physical. He had to use his hands and his staff to dig through the drifts just to reach the latch of the door. He shouted Sisson's name into the wind, but the gale snatched his words away before they could even land. Finally, he pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in a long, rusted protest, and he stepped into the gloom of the interior. The inside of the cabin felt like a tomb. The air was actually colder inside than it was out on the ridge, and it carried a damp, stale quality that made Thompson's skin crawl. In the far corner, huddled under a pile of filthy, frozen blankets, was a shape. Thompson approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs in the quiet. He reached down and pulled back the heavy wool. James Sisson was there, but he was barely a man anymore. He looked like a skeleton wrapped in translucent skin, his eyes wide and glassy with the delirium of the freezing. He had been trapped for weeks as the storms piled up outside his door. His food had run out long ago, and his fire had died out days before. But the true horror lay at the bottom of the bed. Sisson's boots had been pulled off, and his feet were a terrifying ruin of purple and black flesh. Frostbite had claimed them, and the rot of gangrene was already setting in. The smell was faint in the freezing air, but it was unmistakable to a man of the wilderness. It was the smell of death. Thompson knew immediately that he had walked into a tragedy that was still in progress. Sisson couldn't walk. He couldn't even stand, and they were 90 miles of vertical mountain terrain away from the nearest doctor. If you're moved by these stories of the indomitable human spirit and the forgotten history of the high country, I'd be honored if you'd join our circle. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you can sit by the fire with us every week as we uncover these legends. We have many more miles to cover together. As Thompson looked at the dying man, he realized the weight on his shoulders had just become much heavier than any mailbag. He was the only soul in the world who knew Sisson was alive, and he was the only one with even a ghost of a chance of saving him. For the next few hours, the mail carrier set aside his mission and became a nurse. Thompson moved with a frantic, focused efficiency that likely saved Sisson's life in those first few moments. He went back outside, his long skis clattering loudly against the ice, and attacked a nearby dead pine tree with his hatchet. He worked until his muscles burned, dragging the heavy wood inside until shavings and logs were piled high on the hearth. Within minutes, the cheerful crackle of a fire broke the oppressive, deathly silence of the cabin. The warmth began to bleed into the room, slowly thawing the frost that had grown thick on the walls. More painfully, it began to thaw the frozen limbs of the trapper. Thompson searched the cabin and found a small, forgotten cache of flour that Sisson had been far too weak to reach on his own. He mixed it with melted snow to create a crude, warm gruel, and then he sat by the bed and fed the starving man by hand, one spoonful at a time. Sisson began to weep, weak, rasping sobs that shook his frail, bird-like body. He couldn't speak much, but he whispered his thanks over and over, clutching at Thompson's heavy wool sleeve with a hand that looked like a dry claw. But as the fire roared and a bit of color finally returned to Sisson's sunken cheeks, a dark and heavy realization settled over Thompson. This was nothing more than a temporary fix. The wood he had gathered would eventually run out. The small bit of flour would be gone by tomorrow. And most importantly, the gangrene in Sisson's feet was a ticking clock that no fire could stop. It was a poison, moving slowly but surely up his legs toward his heart. If those limbs weren't treated by a proper surgeon, Sisson was going to die a slow, agonizing death right there in that cabin, regardless of how much wood was on the fire. Thompson looked at his massive oak skis leaning against the wall, and then he looked back at the invalid shivering in the bed. He couldn't carry Sisson on his back. The man was dead weight, and the snow was far too deep to drag him along without a proper sled. And Thompson didn't have a sled, nor did he have the materials to build one that could survive the mountain passes. He was faced with a choice that would have broken a lesser man. To save James Sisson, he had to leave him. He had to ski 90 miles back to the settlement of Genoa, completely alone, to fetch a rescue party and a doctor. He had to pray that the fire he built and the supplies he left would last long enough to keep the trapper's soul in his body until he could return. It was a gamble against the very elements themselves. He spent the next hour stacking every single log he could find within Sisson's reach so the man wouldn't have to move. He set a large bucket of snow near the edge of the hearth so it would melt into drinking water. Finally, he looked Sisson directly in the eye, gripped his hand, and made a solemn promise. "I will come back for you," he said, his voice steady and low. Then he stepped out of the warmth, latched the heavy door against the wind, and strapped his boots back into the bindings of his longboards. The sun was dipping below the peaks, the temperature was plummeting, and the most desperate race of his life had officially begun. The journey from that lonely cabin back to the settlement of Genoa was not a leisurely ski through the woods. It was a flat-out sprint against the Reaper himself. 90 miles of the most unforgiving terrain on the North American continent lay before him. Most experienced men, even those born to the mountains, would take at least 3 full days to cover that ground on traditional snowshoes. Thompson, however, intended to do it in less than 24 hours. He pushed off from the cabin, his heavy oak skis hissing like a serpent over the frozen snowpack. Night fell over the mountains like a heavy iron hammer. If you've never been in the high Sierra at night, it is a place of absolute crushing darkness, where the only light comes from the stars, reflecting off the snow to create a ghostly, deceptive, gray illumination. Shadows stretch and warp in the starlight, hiding sudden drop-offs in jagged ravines. Thompson didn't stop to rest. He couldn't afford to. He knew the math of survival as well as he knew the stars. If he stopped to sleep, Sisson died. If he slowed down to catch his breath, Sisson died. It was that simple and that brutal. He climbed the steep western slopes, his breath tearing at his lungs in the thin air, while sweat froze into icicles on his thick blonde beard. The physical exertion was immense, enough to collapse a horse, but the mental toll was even worse. In the deep dark of the wilderness, the mind begins to play cruel tricks on a man. The wind, howling through the high pines, began to sound like human voices screaming for help. The shifting shadows of the trees looked like a pack of wolves stalking his every move. And in truth, they might have been. But Thompson was moving faster than any wolf could navigate that deep powder. He eventually crested the great summit and began the terrifying descent into the Carson Valley. This was, without question, the most dangerous part of the entire trek. He was flying blind into the dark, hitting speeds that would terrify a modern skier with modern equipment. He had nothing but his wooden balance pole to feel the terrain ahead of him, using it like a blind man uses a cane, but at 40 miles an hour. And it was here that we see the first real crack in the armor of the legend. As he passed through the wide, wind-swept area known as Hope Valley, the wind shifted suddenly. This valley was notorious among the mountain men for a specific and deadly phenomenon. The wind would scour the snow into unpredictable, jagged waves of ice that were as hard as granite. If the tip of a 10-foot ski caught one of these invisible ridges at high speed, it wouldn't just trip him, it would snap a man's leg like a dry twig. Thompson felt the vibration start to shudder through his heavy oak boards. It was a rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum of the wood fighting against the ice crust. He felt the chattering in his teeth and his knees. He had to fight every instinct in his body to brake, to pull back, to slow down to a safe crawl. But he knew he couldn't. He had to trust his momentum. He had to ride the razor's edge between incredible speed and total disaster, knowing that a single fall here meant he would freeze to death alone, and the man in the cabin would follow him into the grave shortly after. He locked his core, held his balance pole steady across his chest, and let gravity take him down into the black void of the valley floor. When John Thompson finally glided into the small settlement of Genoa, he didn't look like a man anymore. He looked like a creature made of the mountain itself. He was encrusted in a thick layer of white frost. His vibrant blue scarf was stiff with ice, and his eyes were bloodshot and red-rimmed from the relentless lashing of the wind. It was Christmas Eve, or perhaps it was already Christmas morning. Time had lost all its meaning during his 90-mile sprint through the dark. The town was little more than a cluster of wooden skeletons huddled against the cold. But inside those buildings, people were seeking the warmth of community, the glow of a hearth, and the comfort of a shared bottle of whiskey. Thompson didn't go to his own home to peel off his frozen clothes or seek his own bed. He went straight to the public house, which served as the social heart and soul of the Carson Valley. He burst through the heavy timber doors, bringing a swirling gust of the winter storm inside with him. The room, which had been filled with the low hum of conversation and the clink of glasses, went deathly quiet. Every person in that room knew Snowshoe Thompson. They knew his strength, and they knew his schedule. If he was standing here now, looking like a ghost from the high peaks and arriving off his regular mail run, they knew something was terribly wrong. He stood by the fire, the ice beginning to melt and drip from his beard, and he told them about the cabin near Lake Valley. He told them about the oppressive silence of the mountains and about James Sisson, rotting away in a bed of frozen blankets. He didn't stand there and order them to help. He was a man who understood the weight of what he was asking. He simply told the truth. He needed men. He needed strong, capable men who were willing to haul a heavy sled up the side of a mountain and back down again through a blizzard. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the logs in the fireplace. The men looked at one another, and then they looked at the frost-covered windows. It was a suicide mission, plain and simple. The storms were still raging in the high passes, and the risk was astronomical. Why should 6 men risk their lives for one lonely trapper who in all likelihood was already dead? But this is where the invisible bond of the frontier truly revealed itself. These people lived on the very edge of the known world. They understood, in a way we often forget today, that today it was Sisson trapped in the ice, but tomorrow it could be any one of them. Thompson scanned the faces in the crowd. Miners with coal-dusted skin, ranchers with faces like weathered leather, and tough men with hands calloused by a lifetime of labor. He didn't offer them gold or land or fame. He offered them something much more valuable, a chance to be the only thing standing between a fellow human being and a cold grave. Slowly, the silence was broken by the sound of heavy chairs scraping back against the floorboards. A sturdy man in a canvas duster stood up. Then another followed. Before the fire had even finished melting the ice from Thompson's coat, 6 men had stepped forward. They weren't heroes from a storybook. They were neighbors in wool coats and heavy boots. They spent the next hour gathering everything they would need, thick ropes, every spare blanket in town, and the tools required to fashion a sled out of raw timber. Thompson, exhausted to the very marrow of his bones and fueled only by adrenaline and black coffee, looked at his new team. A silent understanding passed between them. They were going back into the frozen hell he had just escaped, and they were going to do it together, or not at all. The return journey into the teeth of the Sierra was a brutal and immediate reality check for everyone involved. On his solo run, Thompson had been used to flying over the snow on his longboards, skimming across the surface like a water strider on a pond. But this rescue party didn't have the benefit of Norwegian skis. They were equipped with traditional American snowshoes, those wide, webbed, racket-shaped contraptions that were slow, clumsy, and physically exhausting to use over long distances. For every effortless glide Thompson took on his oak planks, the 6 men behind him had to take 10 heavy, plodding steps, lifting their knees high with every movement to clear the deep, soft powder. The pace was agonizingly slow, and Thompson, desperate to reach Sisson before the gangrene claimed him, had to constantly rein himself in. He would ski ahead for a quarter mile to scout the safest path, and then he would have to circle back, watching with growing anxiety as the men struggled against the steepening incline. He looked at the snow, which was beginning to glaze over with that same treacherous ice crust he had encountered in Hope Valley. It was a subtle thrumming under his feet, a warning that the terrain was turning into a sheet of glass that would make hauling a sled nearly impossible. To make matters worse, the weather, which had briefly held for Thompson's mad dash to Genoa, began to turn sour once again. The sky above the peaks curdled into a bruised, sickly purple, and the snow began to fall in earnest. These weren't light flakes. They were thick, heavy clumps of moisture that obscured the trail and added a literal weight to every step the men took. They were sinking. Even with their wide snowshoes, the fresh drift was so deep that they were post-holing, sinking up to their thighs in the white mire. It was like trying to wade through a river of wet concrete. As the hours dragged on, tempers began to fray under the pressure of exhaustion and cold. They were wet, they were shivering, and the poisonous seeds of doubt began to take root in their minds. They started to wonder aloud if Sisson was even still alive. They asked if they were simply marching into a blizzard to recover a frozen corpse. Thompson could see the fatigue clouding their eyes and the way their shoulders slumped under the weight of their packs. He realized he had to be more than just their guide. He had to be their engine. He took the lead, breaking the trail with his massive skis and packing down a firm track for them to follow. He didn't speak to them about the impossible odds or the miles left to go. He spoke only of the next ridge, the next stand of trees, and the next mile. But deep inside, beneath his stoic Norwegian exterior, he was terrified. Every hour they lost on this slow ascent was an hour the infection had to spread through Sisson's blood. They were moving at a crawl, and it felt as though the mountain was doing everything in its power to push them back down into the valley. It took the rescue party several days of backbreaking labor to reach the cabin, a distance that Thompson had covered alone in a matter of hours. When they finally spotted the stone chimney poking out of the drifts, the smoke rising from it was no longer a robust plume. It was thin, wispy, and pale. It was a bad sign, the sign of a fire that was struggling to stay alive. They fell upon the cabin with a desperate energy, digging out the door for the third time and crowding into the small, cramped room. The smell hit them before their eyes could even adjust to the dim light. The heat from the fire, while it had kept Sisson from freezing, had also acted as an incubator for the rot in his feet. The gangrene had become aggressive, the flesh turning a deep, sickly black and beginning to weep. James Sisson was still alive, but he was hanging on by the thinnest of threads. He was lost in a cloud of fever and delirium, drifting in and out of a consciousness that was likely filled with shadows. He looked at the 6 strangers, filling his home with a mix of primal terror and confusion, his eyes darting from face to face until they finally landed on Thompson. A weak, trembling smile cracked his parched lips. "You came back," he whispered, the words barely more than a breath. "I knew you'd come back." But the relief of the reunion was tragically brief. The harsh reality of their situation crashed down on the rescuers like an avalanche. Sisson was in no condition to be carried in a man's arms. He screamed in pure, unadulterated agony if his feet were even brushed by a blanket. They had to build a sled, and they had to do it right then and there. But it couldn't be just any sled. It had to be tough enough to survive the jagged rocks and hidden ice ridges of the Sierra, yet stable enough not to tip over on the 40-degree slopes they had to descend. With no other choice, they began to tear apart the cabin's own furniture. They broke down the heavy timber bunk and used the rough-hewn planks as runners, lashing them together with the thick hemp ropes they had carried up from Genoa. It was a crude, heavy vessel, a coffin on runners, essentially. They lined the bottom with the last of their dry blankets, creating a small, soft nest for the dying man. As they lifted Sisson's skeletal frame into the sled, he let out a cry that was so sharp and jagged it seemed to hang in the air of the small room long after he went silent. The men exchanged grim looks, their faces pale in the firelight. This was the point of no return. Once they stepped out of the shelter of that cabin, there was no turning back for warmth. They were committing themselves to hauling a 200-pound load through a worsening blizzard over some of the most treacherous terrain in all of America. Thompson checked the bindings on the sled one last time, his hands steady despite the cold. He looked at his team, their faces set in grim determination. "Ready?" he asked. No one spoke, but they all reached down and gripped the frozen ropes. They were moving out into the white. The journey out of the mountains was a nightmare of physics, endurance, and raw, bloody-minded will. The air smelled of sharp pine needles and the metallic tang of old ice. Hauling that heavy, improvised sled uphill was a form of back-breaking labor that few men could endure for more than an hour at a time. They had to strain against the rough hemp ropes like draft horses, their boots slipping and sliding in the treacherous, shifting snow as they fought for every agonizing inch of ground. Their lungs burned with the thin, freezing air, and every breath felt like inhaling needles. But as difficult as the climbs were, it was the downhill stretches that held the true horror for the rescue party. On those steep, icy declines, the heavy sled ceased to be a burden and became a lethal missile. Gravity wanted nothing more than to hurl that 200-pound weight straight down the mountain at terminal velocity, smashing everything in its path. The men had to scramble to the rear of the sled, digging their heels into the frozen crust and using the ropes as makeshift brakes to prevent the sled from overrunning them or smashing into the trunk of a massive pine. But the terrain was not a smooth, groomed ramp. It was a chaotic, violent mix of hidden boulders, fallen logs, and sudden, heart-stopping drop-offs that appeared out of the white haze. Every jolt of the wooden runners, every sudden bone-jarring bump against a hidden rock sent a fresh shockwave of white-hot pain through Sisson's ruined, gangrenous feet. His face was a mask of agony, his skin the color of wet parchment, and his eyes were perpetually squeezed shut against the brilliance of the snow. He began to beg them to stop. He pleaded with them, his voice cracking with the strain of his unimaginable agony, to just leave him behind in the drifts or let him slide into a deep ravine. "Kill me," he screamed into the howling, indifferent wind, his hands clutching the sides of the wooden box until his knuckles turned white. "For the love of God, just kill me now and end this." This created a moral dilemma that began to tear at the very hearts of the rescuers. They were good men, neighbors and friends, and hearing another human being beg for death at their hands was almost more than they could bear. Thompson could see the hesitation in their eyes, the way their shoulders slumped under the weight of the impossible decision. To go slow enough to spare Sisson the worst of the pain meant they would almost certainly be caught in the heart of the approaching storm and die of exposure themselves. But to go fast enough to save his life meant they had to effectively torture him with every yard of ground they covered. Thompson, skiing alongside the sled and acting as the primary navigator, had to make the hardest calls of his life. He had to harden his heart against the screams of his friend, pushing aside the bile that rose in his throat and the instinct to offer comfort. He reached up to wipe a layer of frost from his eyebrows, his gaze fixed firmly on the trail ahead. "Keep moving," he would shout over the roar of the gale, his voice sounding harsh and metallic even to his own ears. "Don't look at him. Just keep the ropes tight and keep moving." It felt cruel. It felt utterly heartless. But Thompson knew that sympathy was a luxury they simply could not afford in this wilderness. The infection was racing them to the valley floor, and every second they spent pausing to comfort Sisson was a second the gangrene moved closer to his heart. The real antagonist of this story wasn't a man or a beast, it was the landscape itself, indifferent, brutal, and impossibly cold. The snow seemed to actively fight them, clogging the runners of the sled and hiding obstacles until the last possible moment. The men were reaching the absolute end of their strength, their muscles screaming in protest and their hands raw and bleeding from the friction of the frozen ropes. And then, just when they thought it couldn't get any worse, the sky turned a bruised, ominous purple, and the full force of the storm they had been fearing finally caught them out in the open. The blizzard didn't just arrive, it slammed into them with the force of a physical blow, a solid wall of white that seemed to drop out of the leaden sky without a single second of warning. Within moments, the world they knew vanished, replaced by a swirling, chaotic void where the horizon disappeared and up and down lost all their meaning. The air was thick with ice crystals that tasted like metal and stung like needles against their exposed skin. The sled, already burdened by the heavy weight of the man and the rough-hewn wood, began to collect the driving snow in every crevice, turning it into a literal anchor that refused to slide across the surface. They hit a section of deep, treacherous powder where the runners sank deep into the drifts and simply stayed there, wedged tight against the frozen earth, as if the mountain itself were reaching up to hold them back. The men were blinded by the stinging snow, their eyelashes matted with frost that made it painful to blink. They were completely depleted by days of superhuman effort, their muscles screaming in protest with every shallow breath they took. One by one, they collapsed where they stood, their knees buckling into the soft drifts. They couldn't move the sled another inch. Their strength had been spent, evaporated into the freezing wind. They couldn't even see the path a few feet in front of their faces, only the dancing white ghosts of the storm. And perhaps most terrifying of all, James Sisson had finally stopped screaming. The agonizing cries that had haunted their journey for hours were gone. He was silent now, a heavy and motionless weight in the bottom of the sled, wrapped in stiff, frozen blankets. This silence was infinitely worse than his cries of pain. Thompson stared at the still form, his heart sinking into his boots as he wondered if they were now hauling a coffin. Was he dead? Had they dragged him all this way, through all this unimaginable suffering, only to have him become a frozen corpse in a wooden box? The thought was a cold stone in Thompson's gut. One of the men, a tough, weathered rancher who had been a pillar of strength and resolve for the group, finally reached his breaking point. His hands were so numb he could no longer feel the rough hemp of the rope. He threw his line down into the snow with a gesture of pure defeat and slumped against a jagged rock, his head falling into his hands. "It's no use," he yelled, his voice cracking and barely audible over the shrieking gale that tore the words from his lips. "We're lost. We're going to die out here just like him." Despair is a contagious thing in the wilderness. It can spread through a group faster than frostbite, chilling the spirit long before the body gives out. They huddled together in the freezing lee of a large rock, their bodies shaking uncontrollably as the cold began to seep through their layers of wool and into their very bones. This felt like the end of the line. The mountain had finally won, asserting its dominance over their fragile human will. They were miles from any hope of safety, trapped in a blinding whiteout with no strength left to save themselves, let alone a man who hadn't moved in an hour. Before we see if they can find that one final spark of strength needed to rise from that frozen earth, I want to invite you to join our circle here by the fire. If these stories of the old ways, the grit of the frontier, and the resilience of the human spirit speak to you, please take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. It helps us keep these forgotten legends alive for the next generation, ensuring these stories aren't buried in the snows of time. Now, let's get back to that desperate whiteout in the Sierra. The men were sitting in the snow, their heads bowed against the wind. The silence of the storm was beginning to feel like the heavy silence of the grave, and they simply sat there in the dark, waiting for the cold to take them. In the midst of that howling white void, where the very air felt like it was made of jagged glass and all hope seemed to have frozen solid, John Thompson did something that would be talked about in the Carson Valley for the next 50 years. He stood up. He was not a man given to grand speeches or hollow words of encouragement. He was a man of action, pure and simple. He didn't argue with the rancher who had given up, and he didn't offer any false promises of safety or warmth. Instead, he reached down, with hands that were stiff and clumsy with cold, and unstrapped his heavy oak longboards, setting them aside in the rising drift where they were quickly swallowed by the white. He walked over to the buried sled, sinking all the way to his waist in the fresh, suffocating powder, and began to clear the snow away with his bare hands. His fingers were entirely numb and his face was encrusted with a thick layer of ice that made it difficult to even blink. But he didn't stop for a second. He grabbed the lead rope, the heaviest and most exhausting position in the line, and wrapped it tightly around his chest, feeling the rough hemp bite through his wool coat and into his shoulder. He looked back at the men huddled in the dark, his eyes burning with a ferocious, almost frightening intensity that seemed to cut through the blizzard like a beacon. He didn't shout to be heard over the gale. He simply said, "We are not leaving him." It wasn't a command from a superior officer. It was a simple statement of fact that hung in the freezing air, heavier than the storm itself. Thompson's absolute refusal to yield acted like a spark in the dark. The men looked at him. This foreigner, this mail carrier who had already covered this grueling distance twice over in the last few days. And they felt a hot, prickling shame burn through their exhaustion. If he could still stand, if he could still pull after all he had done, then they knew they had to do it too. Slowly, painfully, their frozen joints cracking in the cold, one by one they stood up from the snow. They reached into the drifts with trembling hands and picked up their ropes. They took their positions, leaning their shoulders into the wind as if they were pushing against a solid wall of ice. Thompson leaned forward, his massive legs driving deep into the yielding snowpack, and he pulled with everything he had left in his soul. The sled groaned, the old wood creaking and complaining under the immense strain. Then, with a sudden, heavy lurch, it shifted. It moved. They were moving again. It wasn't fast, and it certainly wasn't graceful, but they were moving. They found a primitive rhythm in the heart of the storm, a chant of labored breath and shared, agonizing effort. They took one step and then another, moving in a cycle of pulling and breathing, pulling and breathing. They weren't 6 individual men and a leader anymore. They had become a single organism, bound together by rope and iron will, forcing their way through the very teeth of the Sierra Nevada. They were heading for the valley floor, and as the darkness deepened around them, it seemed that nothing on heaven or earth was going to stop them now. They battled through the remainder of that night and deep into the following day, their movements becoming mechanical and heavy as the hours bled into one another. The air smelled of nothing but biting cold and the metallic tang of old snow. The storm finally began to break just as they reached the very edge of the high country, the clouds parting to reveal a landscape that was as beautiful as it was deadly. Below them lay the final descent, the steep, treacherous drop from the Sierra crest down to the floor of the Carson Valley. It was a place where the hemlocks and the pines grew thick and crowded, their branches heavy with a white burden that looked like solid marble. The ground fell away in sudden, dizzying pitches that could steal the breath from a man's lungs. In the height of summer, this was a difficult and punishing hike for a fit man. In the dead of winter, while trying to navigate a crude, heavy sled, it was nothing short of a death trap. The sun was beginning to set once again, casting long, bruised shadows of deep purple and blue across the vast expanse of the snow. As the light faded, the temperature plummeted with a sudden sharp bite that made their skin crawl. The moisture on the surface of the snow began to freeze into a hard, slick crust that shimmered like polished glass in the dying light. While this was good for achieving speed, it was a disaster for anyone trying to maintain control of a heavy, unyielding load. The men were running on nothing but fumes and raw willpower at this point. They were starting to hallucinate from the profound lack of sleep, seeing shadowy shapes moving in the trees that weren't there, and hearing the phantom sounds of bells or distant voices in the wind. One man stumbled, his hand brushing against the rough bark of a tree, and he stared at his own fingers as if he didn't recognize his own limb. Down in the sled, James Sisson had drifted into a deep, unconscious state, his breathing coming in shallow, ragged hitches that worried Thompson more than the terrain. It was the sound of a man who was finally running out of time. They had to get him down to the valley floor right now. There was no time left to set up a camp, and there was certainly no time left to rest their aching bodies. They lined up the sled at the very top of a long, narrow chute that cut a path through the dense trees like a jagged scar. Thompson decided to take the rear position this time, acting as the steersman for the final run. He knelt in the snow to strap his longboards back onto his boots, his frost-bitten fingers fumbling with the leather bindings. He felt the familiar, comforting weight of the oak. He gripped his balance pole with hands that were cracked and sore, holding it ready for the struggle ahead. This was the final run of the journey. He knew that if they lost control here, the sled would inevitably smash into the ancient pines, and the story of James Sisson would end in a pile of broken wood and frozen blood. The men braced their feet, their breath coming in ragged white plumes that vanished instantly in the biting wind. With a final collective shove that strained every muscle in their backs, they pushed the heavy sled off the ledge and into the void. Almost immediately, the sled caught the steep, unforgiving angle of the slope and surged forward with a terrifying momentum. At first, the rescuers tried to hold it back with the guide ropes, their knuckles white as they gripped the hemp lines. They dug their snowshoes deep into the packed snow, leaning back with all their body weight until their spines felt like they might snap. But the frozen crust was far too slick to offer any real purchase. The sled was simply too heavy, a massive weight fueled by the relentless and unforgiving pull of gravity. It picked up speed with every passing second, the runners humming a low, ominous tune against the ice. They were moving at 10 miles an hour, then 15, then 20, the world around them blurring into a streak of white and dark green. The men on the ropes were no longer in control. They were being dragged down the mountain like rag dolls, stumbling and falling as they tried desperately to keep their feet. Soon they were sliding on their backs and their bellies, the frozen snow scouring their skin and the cold biting through their heavy wool coats. Thompson watched with a rising sense of dread, his heart hammering against his ribs. He realized that if they didn't let go, they would be pulled directly into the jagged timber at high speed, their bodies broken against the trunks. He filled his lungs with the freezing air and shouted for them to release the lines, his voice barely audible over the roar of the descent. One by one, the men let go, tumbling into the soft, deep drifts at the edge of the chute. They watched helplessly, gasping for air, as the sled roared past them like a ghost in the storm. Now the sled was entirely free. It was rocketing down the narrow chute like a runaway train, a heavy wooden box carrying a dying man who was completely at the mercy of the elements. It bounced violently over hidden ice ridges, the runners screaming against the frozen crust with a high-pitched wail that echoed off the canyon walls. It careened toward a sharp, dangerous bend in the trail where the mountain dropped away into shadow. At that bend, a cluster of massive granite boulders waited like silent gray sentinels. If the sled hit those rocks at this speed, the wood would shatter into 1,000 splinters, and Sisson, already clinging to life by a thread, would be crushed instantly. The smell of pine and cold stone filled the air, a grim reminder of the mountain's indifference to their plight. Thompson was the only one left in the fight. He was skiing directly behind the sled, his body tucked low in a racing crouch as he matched its incredible, life-threatening speed. His long oak boards thundered over the ice, creating a rhythmic sound like rolling drums that echoed through the dense trees. The wind whipped at his face, stinging his eyes and forcing him to squint against the spray of ice kicked up by the sled's runners. He could see the turn coming up fast, and he could see the jagged, moss-covered edges of the granite boulders waiting for them. The sled was starting to drift wide, losing its line and heading straight for a catastrophic disaster. His mind raced, calculating the distance and the force required to intervene. He had only a few precious seconds to act, and he knew he couldn't simply grab the sled with his hands. The sheer momentum would have ripped his arms right out of their sockets and sent him tumbling to his death. He had to find a way to use the terrain itself, to lean into the physics of the slope and change their destiny before the sled became a coffin. In that desperate, heart-stopping moment, Thompson surged forward, his legs pumping with a rhythmic intensity as he tucked his body into a tight, aerodynamic crouch to cut through the freezing wind. His speed increased rapidly until he was skiing directly alongside the careening sled, the two of them flying down the mountain in a deadly, high-stakes parallel. This was the exact moment where those massive longboards, the heavy 10-foot planks of solid oak that the local miners had mocked so relentlessly, saved every life on that mountain. A lighter, modern ski would have chattered and skipped uncontrollably across the uneven ice, losing its edge and sending the skier tumbling into the abyss. But the sheer, immense weight of the solid oak, combined with Thompson's powerful, mountain-hardened frame, allowed him to hold a steady edge that cut into the frozen crust like a blacksmith's sharpest chisel. He could feel the vibrations of the mountain traveling up through his boots, a raw connection to the earth itself that told him exactly how much pressure the wood could take before snapping. He swung his heavy balance pole, the singular tool that everyone else had dismissed as a primitive relic of the old country, and he jammed it with all his might into the snow on the outside of the turn. He used the pole as a pivot point, creating a fixed anchor in the shifting, chaotic world of the descent. At the very same time, he drove his skis across the path of the sled with a grunt of sheer physical exertion. He wasn't trying to stop it. He knew that was impossible given the laws of physics and the sheer mass of the sled. He was trying to guide it, to nudge its trajectory away from certain death. He leaned his entire body weight into the maneuver, his muscles straining against the heavy fabric of his coat, and slammed the side of his long skis against the wooden runner of the sled. It was a controlled collision at 30 miles an hour, a violent, bone-jarring impact of wood against wood that rattled his teeth and sent a shockwave up his spine. A loud, sharp crack echoed through the silent woods as the timber groaned under the immense stress, but the sled held together. That impact was just enough to nudge the sled off its collision course. It missed the first massive granite boulder by a matter of inches, actually scraping sparks off the face of the grey rock as it flew past, the smell of scorched stone briefly filling the air. Thompson didn't let up for a second. He wrestled the sled back into the center of the chute, using his balance pole as a heavy brake, dragging it deep into the churning snow to bleed off the dangerous runaway speed. His hands were numb from the cold, but his grip remained ironclad, his knuckles white under his leather gloves. He was skiing for two people now, steering his own massive boards and managing the momentum of the runaway sled simultaneously. It was a feat of raw athleticism and mountain craft that defied any reasonable belief. A dance with gravity performed on the edge of a knife. They flew down the remainder of the slope, a blur of motion and spraying snow that sparkled like diamonds in the dim winter light, until the terrain finally began to level out near the base of the mountain. The sled slowed down, hissing softly through the deeper, uncrusted snow of the valley floor, until it finally came to a gentle, rocking stop in a pristine meadow. A profound, heavy silence returned to the mountain, broken only by the distant, lonely sound of the wind in the high pines. Thompson stood there for a long time, his chest heaving as he gasped for the cold air, steam rising in thick, ghostly clouds from his overheated body. He reached up to wipe the frost from his eyebrows, his breath hitching in his throat. He leaned over and looked into the sled, his heart pounding against his ribs. Against all odds, amidst the wreckage of the storm, James Sisson was still breathing, his chest rising and falling in a slow, miraculous rhythm. The other members of the rescue party finally caught up several minutes later, their lungs burning in the freezing air and their legs trembling with every step. Some of them had slid down the slope on their backs, leaving long furrows in the snow, while others had stumbled blindly through the deep drifts on foot, fully expecting to find a mangled scene of wreckage and tragedy at the bottom of the chute. Instead, they found a sight they would never forget. John Thompson, a solitary figure leaning quietly on his balance pole in the silver moonlight, watching over the motionless sled like a silent guardian. No one spoke a word. There were no cheers of victory and no grand speeches of heroism. They were all simply too exhausted, their bodies drained of every last ounce of adrenaline. Thompson merely looked at them, his face caked in ice, and gave a small, tired nod. Without a word, they walked to the front of the sled and picked up the frozen, stiff ropes once again. The terrain was flat now, a merciful relief to their aching backs, and the golden lights of the settlement of Genoa were twinkling in the distance like fallen stars against the dark valley floor. They dragged the sled the final few miles into the heart of the town, the only sound the rhythmic crunch of their boots and the low hiss of the runners over the slush. The local residents, alerted by the frantic echoing barking of the town dogs, began to emerge from their warm homes with lanterns held high in the night air. They stood on their porches, shivering in the cold, and watched a ghostly, silent procession emerge from the darkness of the trail. They saw 6 men, bent double with fatigue and covered in a layer of frost, and a giant on skis, pulling a battered wooden box through the center of town. They brought Sisson into the nearest home, where the air smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and laid him out carefully on a large wooden table near the hearth. The town doctor was summoned immediately, arriving with his worn black bag and a grim professional expression. When the heavy leather boots, stiff with ice and blood, were finally cut away from Sisson's legs, the room fell into a heavy, respectful silence. The sight of the feet was something no one there wanted to remember. The skin was a mottled, sickly color that spoke of death. The gangrene had been relentless, and it had done its terrible work during those long, lonely nights in the cabin. The rescue had been a success in terms of survival, but the cost of the delay was going to be high. The doctor looked up at Thompson and the exhausted rescuers, wiping his hands on a clean cloth, and gave a slow, solemn nod. He told them that the man's life could be saved, but the feet would have to be removed immediately to stop the spread of the poison into his bloodstream. Sisson, who had woken up in the sudden, overwhelming warmth of the house, looked around at the flickering shadows on the walls and the faces of the men who had risked everything to save him. He reached out a trembling hand and gave a small, weak nod of consent. He had known this was coming for days, the cold truth settling in long before he reached the valley. He didn't care about the feet. He was just grateful to be in a room with solid walls, with a crackling fire in the hearth, and with people who cared if he lived or died. He felt the warmth of a wool blanket being tucked around his shoulders, and for the first time in a week, he let out a long, shuddering breath of relief. James Sisson did indeed survive the grueling surgery, though he woke up to a world that looked and felt entirely different. He had to learn a completely new way of existing, navigating life without the feet that had once carried him through the dark tunnels of the mines. He lived for many years after that fateful Christmas, walking on carefully carved wooden stumps that he learned to use with a surprising amount of grace and dignity. You could hear the rhythmic thud-click of his gait on the wooden sidewalks of town, a sound that served as a constant reminder of his survival against the odds. He became a living testament to the sheer grit of the frontier and the incredible heroism of the men who had refused to leave him behind in the dark. As for the 6 men who had volunteered to go with Thompson into the storm, they eventually drifted back to their quiet lives in the mines and on the ranches. Their names have mostly been lost to the passing of time and the fading ink of old records, but they lived out their days with a quiet, inner knowledge of what they had achieved on that frozen mountain. They didn't need a medal or a parade to know they had done something truly extraordinary. And what of John Thompson? He was not a man built for the spotlight or the praise of crowds. He didn't stick around in the valley to wait for accolades or a public ceremony, and he certainly didn't hang around the local saloon to recount his exploits for free drinks. He didn't ask for a reward, and he didn't expect a single cent of payment for saving a man's life. To him, it was simply the right thing to do, a duty owed to a fellow human in need. The very next week, while the town was still buzzing with the news of the rescue, Thompson was already preparing for his next run. He sat on his porch, the air smelling of pine needles and wood smoke, and carefully tightened the leather bindings on his long oak boards. He threw his 80-pound mailbag over his shoulder, feeling the familiar heavy pull against his muscles, and turned his face back toward the high, jagged peaks of the Sierra Nevada. The mail had to get through after all, and there were families on the other side of those mountains waiting for news from the world, counting on him to bridge the gap between civilization and the wilderness. For another 20 years, Snowshoe Thompson continued to cross those formidable mountains in the dead of winter, a solitary figure moving against a backdrop of endless white. He saved other lives during his long tenure, sometimes appearing like a ghost out of the blizzard to guide a lost traveler or deliver life-saving medicine to an isolated cabin. He carried news of births, deaths, and the changing world to the most remote corners of the range. Over time, he became a permanent part of the landscape itself, as reliable as the arrival of the first winter snow and as enduring as the ancient granite peaks he called home. He never saw himself as a hero or a legend to be put on a pedestal. To his own mind, he was just a man doing a difficult job that no one else was willing or able to do. He understood the language of the mountains, the way the wind shifted before a storm, and the way the snow crunched under his boards, and in return, the mountains seemed to respect him, allowing him safe passage when they denied it to everyone else. He walked into the history books with his head down and his skis moving forward, a silent guardian of the high country. In our modern world, we often think of the Wild West as a place defined by gunfights and gold rushes, populated by selfish men seeking nothing but their own fortune. But the story of James Sisson and Snowshoe Thompson reminds us of a different kind of frontier spirit that was just as prevalent. It reminds us that in the harshest, most unforgiving conditions, the light of human compassion often shines the brightest. It wasn't the promise of gold that drove Thompson to ski nearly 200 miles through a blizzard. It wasn't the desire for fame or a place in the history books. It was the simple, unspoken code of the West that said you do not leave a neighbor behind. You do not ignore the silent scream of a chimney with no smoke rising against the pale winter sky, even when the wind is howling and the path is buried in 10 feet of fresh powder. John Thompson passed away in 1876, and he died never having been paid the thousands of dollars the United States government actually owed him for his years of selfless service on those treacherous mail routes. He had spent years petitioning for the money he had earned, yet he never let the bitterness of that rejection stop him from helping those in need. But his true payment wasn't found in a bank account or a vault of gold. It was found in the legacy he left behind. A legacy of incredible strength, superhuman endurance, and a profound, quiet compassion for his fellow man. He walked the earth with a humble heart, knowing that his actions mattered more than any title or paycheck. So, the next time you see a winter storm rolling in over the horizon, turning the world into a blur of white and gray, I want you to think of the man on the 10-foot oak skis. Imagine him holding his wooden balance pole firmly against the freezing wind, adjusting his wool scarf with a gloved hand, and riding into the dark to save a stranger he had never even met. If this story of the High Sierra and the grit of the frontier moved you, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing to our channel and joining our circle here by the campfire. We have countless more stories of the frontier, of the men and women who built this country with their bare hands and iron wills, just waiting to be told. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what you think was the most incredible part of Thompson's long journey across the mountains. Was it his speed, his strength, or his heart? Until we meet again for the next tale, keep your fire burning bright, stay warm, and never forget the legends of the old ways.